Hello, I want to invite you into a introduction to the book by Charles Williams. The book is Descent into Hell, and our format for these lessons will be that I'll give an introduction to each of the chapters, and then we'll have a chapter being read by me because it's kind of a difficult book to read on one's own. It was written in the 1930s in England. The author, Charles Williams, a very bright, educated man who had a large vocabulary and a poetic flair. In fact, he did a lot of poetry. He made the book in such a fashion that it's poetic in its reading, and that's kind of difficult if we're used to reading something far simpler than that. And then before the next chapter, I'll do another introduction, but I'll probably do some comments of summarizing from the previous chapter as well. But let me just talk for a moment about the book. The book Descent into Hell is a book about spiritual salvation or damnation, and it takes place in a small community 30 miles north of London, a fictitious community, which the author Charles Williams calls Battle Hill. Now, Battle Hill also refers to a number of battles that took place there historically throughout England's history, and but it also is a word that speaks about the spiritual battle that's going on, and the characters are having to make choices as they go through the book that affect their eternal life or damnation. And there's there are a number of key words that come into play in the book, and when you see those over and over again, you're led to kind of hone in on that and understand what he's trying to say. So he uses words that relate to speed, haste and quick and hurry, and those kind of words. Help us understand that this book that's about salvation is also talking about how quickly we move through human life. And as we do, we make choices. And those choices hurry us on toward our eternal destinies. And so it's a very serious book in that respect. And appropriately, when you look at this book, there are some characters who are good, who are making good choices. And there are some characters who are not making good choices. And what is happening to those different characters reveals some things about how we are to go through life, and about sometimes the choices that we make that we're hardly even aware of, that are moving us one way or another on this pathway of our eternal destiny. Now, Williams writes this in the 1930s, and in America we were going through a world depression, the Great Depression. I don't know what they were doing in England, but this is a wealthy community, this Battle Hill. And in the 1930s there were young people who had not decided on their careers and maybe had not gone on to college or whatever, and they were in their mid-20s, but living in this community, this well-off community. They had some privilege, and so they were able to go play tennis or take motor rides or be involved in this dramatic club that was going to put on a play over the summertime. And because it's the 1930s, you go back to World War I, and we're told that Peter Stanhope, the owner of the manor house in the community of Battle Hill, who's a playwright and who is the one that has written the play that this dramatic club is going to enact as they practice it over the summer, that he was born there, but it had been owned by very wealthy people, and he came to own it again and to take it back from previous owners sometime after World War I. It says after the war, but that's World War I. And so in the 1920s, he's writing plays. They're produced in the London theater, and he's become quite wealthy. And now he's written a new play. And we're told that his plays, in this first chapter, his plays have begun to take on a spiritual edge. He's concerned with the matters of the soul. And so he offers this newest play that he's written, which just is called a pastoral, to this group to perform. Now, I think whenever you're reading a book, you want to pay attention to the characters' names. Are they just have no meaning at all, or do they have some kind of meaning? Are they suggestive in any way? We've already talked about Battle Hill having the suggestion of the spiritual battle that takes place in the human person. But the main character of Peter Stanhope, Peter, kind of the Apostle Peter, Stand and Hope, Stanhope, together have some suggestion, and he is in some ways a Christian figure, the Christ figure in the book. Not in that he suffers, but in his way of teaching and giving direction as he does it later on to Pauline. Pauline Anstruther is another character in the book, and she has the name Pauline, and a book that has so much to do with Galatians 6:2, to bear one another's burdens. To name a person, a woman, Pauline, is to get at that idea of something from the Gospels of Paul. And then there are some other characters. There is Lawrence Wentworth, and his character is slowly deteriorating in the book as he's making poor choices. And so the last name of Wentworth, like this worth is gone, is suggestive there. There is Adela Hunt, and she has that last name of Hunt. And she's also a person who does a lot of seeking. She's seeking things for herself in her relationship to Lawrence Wentworth, in her relationship to Hugh Prescott, in her relationship to Catherine Perry and the play and the other young people in the group. And there's Myrtle Fox, which is sort of thrown in for a joke that he uses in the very beginning about the foxes have holes and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. And so that's perhaps why the author puts in that name. Then there are some other ones that will be introduced into future chapters. And there's a Mrs. Anstruther, who's very instrumental in the book, and a woman in her 90s who's Pauline's grandmother, which is the reason why she's there. She's caretaking for her grandmother. This woman is accepting her approaching death, and there's a lot of beauty in that. I was just going to mention that sometimes when I read a book that there's no movie of the book, sometimes, when you read a book and they've made a movie and you've seen the movie and now you're reading the book, you imagine the characters with the persons who are actors and actresses in the book, so that you see them. And sometimes when I'm reading a book that, not a movie about it, but I'm looking at the characters and things about them, the image of somebody comes to mind. And a lot of times, just because we see things on television, what comes to mind are actors that we're used to seeing on programs. And so in this book, when I was reading it through after several readings, I began to imagine Peter Stanhope, and in my mind I was seeing the British actor Frank Thornton, who played Captain Stephen Peacock in the British comedy series Are You Being Served? And that was done in the late 1970s and into the 1980s. And Captain Peacock, this Frank Thornton, was a tall, distinguished-looking gentleman, speaking very formal English on the floor of Grace Brothers with the other actors in that show. He's actually 6'1" and distinguished and up in age. I think he was in his 50s when the program was being done. And that's how I imagined Peter Stanhope. And then when it came to Pauline, who's the significant figure in the book and what happens to her, she's described as tall and she's got long hair and plain and so forth. For whatever reason, I imagine in my mind the actress Laura Prepon, who was Donna Pinciotti in the program That 70s Show, and just saw her when I was seeing Pauline. And Mrs. Anstruther is so vital in the book, an elderly woman in her 90s, and she's accepting death. When I was picturing her, I was picturing a member of North Baptist Church who passed away, Janet Shields, because I had the privilege of seeing Janet many, many times as she was coming closer and closer to death. And indeed, when she was at the Kohlbacher house, and I was actually at her bedside 15 minutes after she passed away. The chaplain and the nurse that were there at her death had left the room to call Cedric. And the chaplain happened to come back in, seeing that somebody had been going down the hall to visit, and I just had been coming in that morning. And I sat down. Well, she looked the same that she did the day before, when she was just laying there in a coma. And so I didn't know she had passed away. And I was sitting there just talking with her and praying for her, and she'd already gone on to be with the Lord. But Mrs. Anstruther in the book approaches death so so peacefully that I thought of Janet Shields. Now let me talk a little bit about some specific things in the book in chapter 1. We're introduced to Peter Stanhope, who's this playwright who's written the play just called A Pastoral, which has to do with a rural country setting. We're told that he owns the manor house. Now in England, in the Middle Ages, they had these forts, and the forts were owned by the wealthy noblemen, and they were large estates. And hundreds of people from the countryside would come and work at this place, and these forts were also protection. If there was a rivalry with somebody else and an army would come, they would offer some protection. And so these estates gradually, during times of peace, and as the fortresses began to crumble, they became these manor homes. And they were large estates with large, massive grounds that still hired people from the countryside. Well, here, Charles Williams imagines Battle Hill, 30 miles north of London, and it's on this rise of ground. And at the top of the ground is this summit house, which is the manor house, and it's a large estate. The thing about Peter Stanhope, whom we're introduced, this playwright who's now moving on beyond toward the end part of his career, having been very successful and very wealthy, and his plays are taking on aspects of the soul rather than just other kinds of themes and issues. We're told about him, and he owns the manor house, and he's generously giving the play, his new play, to this group to perform. And it's striking that there's never any mention of his servants, of the people that he employs, but obviously he's got this lawn and this garden, and he owns this giant place. But we're told that he's there being the host of this dramatic club, and they're all lined up, and he reads the play to them, and he answers their question. And as you move through the book, he's doing things, running errands for the group as they practice the play night after night, all summer long, on his estate. And I find that rather striking. And in fact, here in the first chapter, he's passing out sandwiches, and that comes into the discussion as well. So I think you get a picture of this wealthy person and almost a godlike surrounding to him in terms of his generosity, and he's not just overlording it over people. In fact, later on in the book, we're going to be told Pauline, after some dramatic moments with him, leaves, and as she goes out of the house into going back home, Williams remarks that she does so in this joy because the manor house had almost become a public house of enjoyment, that's striking. Now, then we're also introduced to Lawrence Wentworth, who's an historian and the second most famous person in Battle Hill. But watch this on page 6. Stanhope, though the most glorious, was not the only notorious figure on the hill. You'll have to get used to the double meanings in a lot of the things that Williams uses. But he speaks of Stanhope here in this fairly simple sentence, is glorious, and Mr. Wentworth as notorious. You can kind of miss that if you're not paying attention. And then Lawrence Wentworth was this distinguished living authority on military history. And so I think you'll find that rather helpful because there's already a suggestion here in the first chapter on page 6 that Lawrence Wentworth is going to be less glorious and more notorious as the book goes on. Then you're introduced to Catherine Perry, and she's a woman who we're not told that she has any husband. She may be a widow or whatever, but she has produced plays through this amateur club, for a long time. She's a mature, older woman who's good at this, and she's going to do this play. And so she's the one that's rallying the group and going to be making some decisions and leading the discussion, and she's going to be talking to Peter Stanhope about the meaning of certain things in the play, and she's going to push him to kind of define this chorus, which is so integral to the play. And that's all in the first chapter. And then you have Adela Hunt. And Adela is a young woman, and she's described as very ambitious, and she is the leader of this younger set. And we can imagine that most of the people that are in the play are these young people who are kind of there for the summer and free to do this. She would like to be producing the play. In fact, later, toward the end of the book, she's trying to wiggle her way into getting the rights to do the play in London. Finding some little theater in which she could be the producer of it. So she's ambitious, and she's attractive, and she's going to end up being the princess in the story. That's the part that she will take. And she has a boyfriend by the name of Hugh Prescott. And Hugh, that name suggesting huge, he's tall, he's big. He works in an office in London, so he's a mid-20s age guy. He's not decided what he's going to do with his life, but he's kind of deciding he wants to marry Adela Hunt. And the other side note that will come into the second chapter is Adela Hunt has this kind of connection with Lawrence Wentworth, who has given her favors and spent time doting on her, and so she's got that, and she's going to try to play that every way she can to her advantage. And so those people are mentioned as well. But then there's Pauline Anstruther, and we discover that she's an orphan. Her parents have died, and her uncle, who's the next living relative to kind of be responsible for her, has decided that she should come and live at Battle Hill and take care of his mother, who's in her 90s and not well. And so Pauline's uncle works in London. He's married, and he's got business and family taking him there, and he doesn't have time to take care of his mother. So he kills two birds with one stone by saying, Pauline, you don't have a job, your parents have died. Why don't you come and accept my generosity, and you can take care of my mother, and you can live in this nice home in Battle Hill, which she does. And Pauline then is described as this tall, plain gal who's an orphan, But when she's introduced in the chapter 1, by responding to the discussion in the play, you see that she's intelligent and thoughtful, and she really understands the play and the poetry and so forth. And so you get some other pictures of her character. But then toward the very end of chapter 1, we discover that Pauline, and she's 26, she has all her life, since she was a small girl, been haunted by an apparition of her own self, which comes toward her in her clothes and looking like her, exactly like her. And before it reaches her, it always turns aside. And we're told that in her first 24 years, she saw this apparition 9 times. And later in the book, we'll discover that one of those times was after she had stolen some money from her mother and gone to the store and bought some treats and done something bad. But anyway, the other 9 appearances had occurred in the 2 years that she had been spending taking care of her grandmother on Battle Hill. And so they're more frequent now. And she lives in constant fear. And she can't bring herself to stay inside the home. But she is always fearful when she goes out that she will see this apparition. And as it comes toward her, she's just frightened out of her mind that if it comes and actually meets her and she talks with it, she'll just die. So anyway, so we're introduced to that fear that she has, and that, you know, playing into something with a spiritual battle of good and evil in the human soul, and a good character beginning with fear. There's a description here of the movement in Christian life, and you begin to get some key insight into that already in the beginning of chapter 1. So at the end of this chapter, she does walk home, and she leaves the others who she's walked part of the way with, and then she tries to put this apparition out of her mind and think of anything else that she can, but there's just fear, and she's counting the houses till she gets to her grandmother's home. And she sees the apparition, and it begins to walk toward her, and she refuses to run, but she quickly moves and, you know, goes to the gate and gets to the door and just fumbles with her key into the keyhole and then gets inside and puts her hand up against the door to keep out that apparition should it come toward the house. And that's how chapter 1 ends. And so we're introduced to a few of the characters, and we're introduced to this fear that Pauline has that will play into some important pieces in the story. So hopefully you'll listen now to chapter 1, and just from these comments that I've made, you begin to piece together some of what Charles Williams is beginning to say already in the very beginning of the book. So enjoy it. Descent into Hell by Charles Williams. Chapter 1, The Magus Zoroaster. It undoubtedly needs, Peter Stanhope said, a final putting together, but there's hardly time for that before July. And if you're willing to take it as it is, why... He made a gesture of presentation and dropped his eyes, thus missing the hasty, reciprocal gesture of gratitude with which Mrs. Perry immediately replied on behalf of the dramatic culture of Battle Hill. Behind and beyond her, the culture, some 30 faces, unessentially exhibited to each other by the May sunlight, settled to attention, naturally, efficiently, critically, solemnly, reverently. The grounds of the manor house expanded beyond them. The universal sky sustained the whole. Peter Stanhope began to read his play. Battle Hill was one of the new estates which had been laid out after the war. It lay about 30 miles north of London and took its title from the more ancient name of the broad rise of ground which it covered. It had a quiet ostentation of comfort and culture. The poor who had created it had been as far as possible excluded, nor except as hired servants were they permitted to experience the bitterness of others' stares. The civil wars which existed there, however bitter, were conducted with all bourgeois propriety. Politics, religion, art, science grouped themselves and courteously completed for numbers and reputation. This summer, however, had seen a spectacular triumph of drama, for it had become known that Peter Stanhope had consented to allow the restless talent of the Hill to produce his latest play. He was undoubtedly the most famous inhabitant. He was a cadet of that family which owned the manor house, and he had bought it back from more recent occupiers and himself settled in it before the war. He had been able to do this because he was something more than a cadet of good family, being also a poet in the direct English line, and so much after the style of his greatest predecessor that he made money out of poetry. His name was admired by his contemporaries and respected by the young. He had even imposed modern plays in verse on the London theatre, and 2 of them tragedies at that, with a farce or 2 and histories for variation and pleasure. He was a kind of figure who might be more profitable to his neighborhood dead than alive. Dead, he would have given a shrine. Alive, he deprecated worshippers. The young men at the estate office made a refined publicity out of his privacy. The name of Peter Stanhope would be whispered without comment. He endured the growing invasion with a great deal of good humor and was content to see the hill of his birth become a suburb of the city, as in another sense it would always be. There was, in that latest poetry, no contention between the presences of life and of death. So little indeed that there had been a contention in the Sunday Times whether Stanhope were a pessimist or an optimist. He himself said in reply to an interviewer's question that he was an optimist and hated it. Stanhope, though the most glorious, was not the only notorious figure of the Hill. There was Mr. Lawrence Wentworth, who was the most distinguished living authority on military history, perhaps excepting Mr. Aston Moffat. Mr. Wentworth was not in the garden on that afternoon. Mrs. Catherine Perry was. And it was she who had produced the play, as in many places and at many times she had produced others. She sat near Stanhope now, almost as tall as he, and with more active, though not brighter eyes. They were part of that presence which was so necessary to her profession. Capacity, which in her nature had reached the extreme of active life, seemed in him to have entered the contemplative, so much that his art became a thing of his soul. Where in their own separate private affairs, he interfered so little as almost to seem inefficient. She was so efficient as almost to seem interfering. In the curve of women and men beyond her, other figures less generally famous sat or lay as the depth of their chairs induced them. There were rising young men and a few risen and retired old. There were ambitious young women and sullen young women and loquacious young women. They were all attentive, though as a whole a little disappointed. They had understood that Mr. Stanhope had been writing a comedy and had been hoping for a modern comedy. When he had been approached, however, he had been easy but firm. He had been playing with a pastoral. If they would take a pastoral, it was very much at their service. Hopes and hints of modern comedies were unrealized. It was the pastoral or nothing. They had to be content. He consented to read it to them. He would not do more. He declined to make suggestions for the cast. He declined to produce. He would like for his own enjoyment to come to some of the rehearsals, but he made it clear that he had otherwise no wish to interfere. Nothing giving the necessity of a pastoral could be better. The production would have all the advantage of his delayed death without losing any advantage of his prolonged life. As this became clear, the company grew reconciled. They gazed and listened while from the long, lean figure outstretched in its deck chair there issued the complex intonation of great verse. Never negligible, Stanhope was often neglected. He was everyone's second thought, but no one's first. The convenience of all had determined this afternoon that he should be the first, and his neat mass of gray hair, his vivid glance that rose sometimes from the manuscript and floated down the rows and sank again, and his occasional friendly gesture that seemed about to deprecate but always stopped short, received the concentration of his visitors, and of Mrs. Perry, the chief of his visitors. It became clear to Mrs. Perry as the afternoon and the voice went on that the poet had been quite right when he said that the play needed pulling together. "It's all higgledy-piggledy," she said to herself, using a word which a friend had once applied to a production of The Tempest, and in fact to The Tempest itself. Mrs. Perry thought that this pastoral was in some ways rather like The Tempest. Mr. Stanhope, of course, was not as good as Shakespeare, because Shakespeare was the greatest English poet, so that Stanhope wasn't. But there was something. To begin with, it had no title beyond a pastoral. Well, this was unsatisfactory. Then the plot was incredibly loose. It was of no particular time and no particular place. And to any cultured listener, it seemed to have little bits of everything and everybody put in at odd moments. The verse was undoubtedly Stanhope's, of his own latest, most heightened, and most epigrammatic style. But now and then all kinds of reminiscences moved in. Once during the second act, the word pastiche floated through Mrs. Perry's mind, but went away again on her questioning whether a pastiche would be worth the trouble of production. There was the Grand Duke in it, who had a beautiful daughter, and his daughter either escaped from the palace or was abducted. Anyhow, she came into the power of a number of brigands, and there was a woodcutter's son who frequently burned leaves, and he and the princess fell in love, and there were two farmers who were at odds, and the Grand Duke turned up in disguise, first in the village and then in the forest, through which also wandered an escaped bear, who spoke the most complex verse, excepting the chorus. The chorus had no kind of other name. At first, Mrs. Perry thought they might be villagers. Then, since they were generally present in the forest, she thought they might be trees, or perhaps with a vague reminiscence of Comus spirits. Stanhope had not been very helpful. He had alluded to them as an experiment. By the end of the reading, it was clear to Mrs. Perry that it was very necessary to decide what exactly this chorus was to be. She had discouraged discussion of the play during the interval between the four acts, and as soon as it was over, tea was served. If, however, the poet hoped to get away from discussion by means of tea, he was mistaken. There was a little hesitation over the correct word. Fantastic was dangerous, and poetic both unpopular and supererogatory, though both served for variation on idyllic, which was Mrs. Perry's choice and won by lengths. As she took her second cup of tea, however, she began to close. She said, "Yes, idyllic, Mr. Stanhope, and so significant." "It's very good of you," Stanhope murmured, "but you must see I was right about revision. The plot must seem very loose." Mrs. Perry waved the plot up to benevolence. "But there are a few points," she went on. "The chorus now, I don't think I follow the chorus." "The chorus could be omitted," Stanhope said. "It's not absolutely necessary to a presentation." Before Mrs. Perry could answer, a young woman named Adela Hunt, sitting close by, leaned forward. She was the leader of the younger artistic party, who were not altogether happy with Mrs. Perry, and had some thought, and Mrs. Adela had some thoughts of taking up production herself as her life work. and it would have been a great advantage to have started right away with Peter Stanhope. But her following was not yet strong enough to deal with Mrs. Perry's reputation. She was determined, however, if possible, to achieve a kind of collaboration by means of correction. "Oh, we oughtn't to omit anything. Omit anything, ought we?" she protested. "A work of art can't spare anything that's a part of it." "My dear," Mrs. Perry said, "you must consider your audience. What will the audience make of the chorus?" "It's for them to make what they can of it," Adela answered. "We can only give them a symbol. Art's always symbolic, isn't it?" Mrs. Perry pursed her lips. "I wouldn't say symbolic exactly," she said. "It has significance, of course, and you've got to convey the significance to the audience. We want to present it, to interpret it." As she paused, distracted by the presentation by the poet of two kinds of sandwiches, Adela broke in. "But Mrs. Perry, how can one interpret a symbol? One can only mass it. It's all of a piece, and it's the total effect that creates the symbolic force." "Significant, not symbolical," said Mrs. Perry firmly. "You mustn't play down to your audience, but you mustn't play away from there either. You must," she gesticulated, "intertwine, harmonize. So you must make it easy for them to begin to get harmony. That's what's wrong with a great deal of modern art. It doesn't establish equilibrium with its audience or whatnot. In a pastoral play, you must have equilibrium." "But the equilibrium's in the play," Adela urged again, "a balance of masses. Surely that's what drama is, a symbolical contrast of masses." "Well," Mrs. Perry answered with infuriating tolerance, "I suppose you might call it that, but it's more effective to think of it as significant equilibrium, especially for a pastoral. However, let's be abstract. The question is, what's to be done about the chorus? Had we better keep it in or leave it out? Which would you prefer, Mr. Stanhope?" "I should prefer it in, if you ask me," Stanhope said politely, "but not to inconvenience the production." "It seems to be in the forest so often," Mrs. Perry mused, dismissing cake. "There's the distant song in the first act when the princess goes away from the palace, and the choric dialogue when it isn't dryads, is it?" A friend of Adela's, a massive and superb young man of 25, offered a remark. "Dryads would rather wreck the 18th century, wouldn't they?" "Watteau," said the young lady near Adela. "You could have them, period." Mrs. Perry looked at her approvingly. "Exactly, my dear," she said. A very charming fantasy it mightn't be. We must take care it isn't precious. Only period. But, Mr. Stanhope, you haven't told us. Are they dryads?" "Actually," Stanhope answered, "as I told you, it's more an experiment than anything else. The main thing was that they were non-human." "Spirits," said the Watteau young lady with a thrill of pleasure. "If you like," said Stanhope, "only not spiritual, alive, but with a different life, even from the princess." "Irony," Adela exclaimed. "It's kind of a comment, isn't it, Mr. Stanhope, on futility, the forest and everything, and the princess and her lover, so transitory." Stanhope shook his head. There was a story, invented by himself, that the Times had once sent a representative to ask for an explanation about a new play, and that Stanhope, in his efforts to explain it, had found after 4 hours that he'd only succeeded in reading the play completely through aloud, which he maintained was the only way to explain it. "No," he said, "now, not irony. I think perhaps you'd better cut them out." There was a moment's pause. "But we can't do that, Mr. Stanhope," said a voice. "They're important to the poetry, aren't they?" It was the voice of another young woman sitting behind Adela. Her name was Pauline Anstruther, and compared with Adela, she was generally silent. Now, after her quick question, she added hastily, "I mean, they come in when the princess and the woodcutter come together, don't they?" Stanhope looked at her, and she felt as if his eyes had opened suddenly. He said, more slowly, "In a way, but they needn't." We could just make them chance." "I don't think that would be nearly as satisfactory," Mrs. Perry said. "I'm beginning to see my way. The trees, perhaps, leaves, to have the leaves of the wood, all so helpful to the young people, so charming." "It's a terribly sweet idea," said the Watteau young lady, "and so true, too." Pauline was sitting next to her, said in an undertone, "True?" "Don't you think so?" Watteau, whose actual name was Myrtle Fox, asked. "It's what I always feel about trees and flowers and leaves and so on. They're so friendly. Perhaps you haven't noticed it so much. I'm rather mystic about nature. Like Wordsworth, I love to spend days out with nothing but the trees and the leaves and the wind, only somehow one never seems to have the time. But I do believe they're all breathing in with us, and it's such a comfort. Where there are so many trees, of course, we've only to sink into ourselves to find peace. And trees and clouds and so all would help us. One need never be unhappy. Nature's so terribly good. Don't you think so, Mr. Stanhope?" Stanhope was standing by, silent, while Mrs. Perry communed with her soul and with one of her two neighbors on the possibility of dressing the chorus. He turned his head and answered, "That nature is terribly good?" "Yes, Miss Fox, you do mean terribly." "Why, certainly," Miss Fox said. "Terribly, dreadfully, very." "Yes," Stanhope said again, "very, only you must forgive me, it comes from doing so much writing. But when I say terribly, I think I mean full of terror, a dreadful goodness." "Well, I don't see how goodness can be dreadful," Miss Fox said, with a shade of resentment in her voice. "If things are good, they needn't be terrifying, are they?" "It was you who said terribly," Stanhope reminded her with a smile. "I only agreed." "And if things are terrifying," Pauline put in, her eyes half closed and her head turned away as if she asked a casual question, rather of the world than of him, "can they be good?" He looked down at her. "Yes, surely," he said with more energy. "Are our tremors to measure the omnipotence?" "We'll have them in shades of green then," Mrs. Perry broke in. "Light to dark with rich gold sashes and embroidery, running all over like twigs, and each one carrying a conventionalized bough. Different lengths, I think. Dark gold stockings." "To suggest the trunks?" asked Adela's friend, Hugh Prescott. "Quite," Mrs. Perry said, and then hesitated. "I'm not sure. Perhaps we better keep the leaf significances. When they're still, of course, they could stand with their legs entwined." "With one another?" Adela asked in conscious amazement. "My dear child, don't be absurd," Mrs. Perry said. "Each pair of legs just cross so," and she interlaced her own. "I could never stand still like that," Miss Fox said with great conviction. "You'd have your arms stretched out to people's shoulders on each side," Mrs. Perry said dubiously, "and a little gentle swaying wouldn't be inappropriate, but perhaps we better not risk it. Better have green stockings. We can manage some lovely groupings. We could call the chorus of leaf spirits, Mr. Stanhope." "Sweet," said Miss Fox. Adela, leaning back to Hugh Prescott, said in a very low voice, "I told you, Hugh, she'll ruin the whole thing. She's got no idea of Mass. She ought to block it violently and leave it without a name. I wouldn't even have chorus. I hope he won't give in to her, but he's rather weak." However, Stanhope was, in the politest language, declining to have anything of the sort. "Call it the chorus," he said, "or if you like, I'll try and find a name for the leader, and the rest can just dance and sing. But I'm afraid leaf spirits would be misleading." "What about chorus of nature powers?" asked Miss Fox, but Stanhope only said, smiling, "You will try and make the trees friendly," which no one quite understood, and shook his head again. Prescott asked, "Incidentally, I suppose they will be women?" Mrs. Perry had said, "Oh, of course, Mr. Prescott," before the question reached her brain. When it did, she added, "At least I naturally took it for granted. They are feminine, aren't they?" Still hankering after Mass, Adela said, "It sounds to me more like undifferentiated sex force," and ignored Hugh's murmur, "There isn't much fun in that." "I don't know that they were meant to be either male or female," Stanhope said. "I told you they were more of an experiment in a different kind of existence. But whether men or women are most like that's another matter. He shed an apologetic smile on Mrs. Perry. If they're going to be leaves, Miss Fox asked, couldn't they all wear huge green leaves so that no one would know if they were wearing knee breeches or skirts? There was a pause while everyone took this in. Then Mrs. Perry said very firmly, I don't think that would answer, while Hugh Prescott said to Adela, chorus of fig leaves. Why not follow the old pantomime or present musical comedy, Stanhope asked, and dress your feminine chorus in exquisite male costumes? That's what Shakespeare did with his heroines as often as he could, and made a diagram of something more sharp and wonderful than either. I don't think you'll do better. Masculine voices, except boys, would hardly do, nor feminine appearances. Mrs. Perry sighed, and everyone contemplated the problem again. Adela Hunt and Hugh Prescott discussed modernity between themselves. Pauline, lying back like Stanhope in her chair, was thinking of Stanhope's phrases, a different life, a terrible good, and wondering if they were related. If this chorus over which they were spending so much trouble were indeed an effort to shape in verse a good so alien as to be terrifying. She had never considered good as a thing of terror, and certainly she had not supposed a certain thing of terror in her own secret life as any possible good. Nor now, yet, there had been an inhumanity in the great and moving lines of the chorus. She thought with an anger generous in its origin, but proud and narrow in its conclusion, that not many of the audience really cared for poetry, or for Stanhope's poetry, perhaps none but she. He was a great poet, one of a very few, but what would he do if one evening he met himself coming up the drive? Doppelganger, the learned called it, which was no comfort. Another poet had thought of it. She had to learn the lines at school as an extra task because of undone work. The Magus Zoroaster, my dead child, met his own image walking in the garden. She had never done the imposition, for she had had nightmares that night after reading the lines and had to go sick for days. But she had always hated Shelley since for making it so lovely, when it wasn't loveliness but black panic. Shelley never seemed to suggest that the good might be terrible. What would Peter Stanhope do? What would he if he met himself? They were going. People were getting up and moving off. Everyone was being agreeably grateful to Stanhope for his lawn, his tea, and his poetry. In her fear of solitude, she attached herself to Adela and Hugh and Myrtle Fox, who were all saying goodbye at once. And as he shook hands, he said casually, "You don't think they are?" And she did not immediately understand the reference to the measurement of omnipotence by mortal tremors. Her mind was on Myrtle, who lived near her. She hated the pang of gratitude she felt, and hated it more because she despised Miss Fox. But at least she wouldn't be alone, and the thing she hated most only came, or had so far only come, when she was alone. She struck close to Myrtle, listening to Adela as they went. "Pure waste," Adela was saying. "Of course Stanhope's dreadfully traditional." How continually, Pauline thought, people misuse words like dreadful, if they knew what dread was. But he's got a kind of weight, only he dissipates it. He undermines his mass. Don't you think so, Pauline? "I don't know," Pauline said shortly, and then added with a private and lying malice, "I'm no judge of literature." "Perhaps not," Adela said, "though I think it's more a question of general sensitiveness. Hugh, did you notice how the Perry talked of significance? Why, no one with a really adult mind could possibly... Oh, goodbye, Pauline. I may see you tomorrow." Her voice passed away, accompanied by Hugh's temporary and lazy silence. And Pauline was left to Myrtle's monologues on the comforting friendliness of sunsets. Even that had to stop when they reached the Fox's hole. Myrtle, in a spasm of friendship for Messias, frequently called it that. As they parted upon the easy joke, Pauline felt the rest of the sentence pierce her. She took it in her with a sincerity of pain which almost excused the annexation. The Son of Man hath not where to lay his head. It was the cry of her loneliness and fear, and it meant nothing to her mind but the empty streets and that fear itself. She went on. Not to think of something else, if she could. It was so hopeless. She was trying not to look ahead for fear she saw it, and also to look ahead for fear she was yielding to fear. She walked down the road quickly and firmly, remembering the many thousand times it had not come. But the visitation was increasing, growing nearer and clearer and more frequent. In her first 24 years, she had seen it 9 times. At first, she had tried to speak of it. She had been told when she was small not to be silly and not to be naughty. Once when she was adolescent, she had actually told her mother. Her mother was understanding in most things and knew it. But at this, the understanding had disappeared. Her eyes had become as sharp as when her husband, by breaking his arm, had spoiled a holiday in Spain which she, for all their sakes, had planned. She had refused to speak any more to Pauline that day, and neither of them had quite forgiven the other. But in those days, the comings, as she called them, had been rare. Since her parents had died and she had been sent to live and look after her grandmother in Battle Hill, they had become more frequent, as if the hill was fortunate and favorable to apparitions beyond men, a haunt of alien life. There had been 9 in 2 years, as many as in all the years before. She could not speak of it to her grandmother, who was too old, nor to anyone else, since she had never discovered any closeness of friendship. But what would happen when the thing that she came up to her and spoke or touched, so hard always to turn aside, down some turning, or even apparently into some house? She might have been deceived were it not for the chill in her blood, but if someday it did not. A maid came out of a house a little further down the road and crossed the pavement to a pillar box. Pauline, in the first glance, felt the sickness at her heart. Relieved, she reacted into the admission that she was only 23 houses away from her home. She knew every one of them. She had not avoided so much measurement of danger. It had never appeared to her indoors, nor even on the hill, which seemed to be so convenient for it. Sometimes she longed always to stay indoors. It could not be done, nor would she do it. She drove herself out. But the front door was still a goal and a protection. She always seemed to herself to crouch and cling before she left it, coveting the peace which everyone but she had. 21, 20. She would not run. She would not keep her eyes on the pavement. She would walk steadily forward, head up and eyes before her. 17, 16. She would think of something, of Peter Stanhope's play, A Terrible Good. The whole world was for her a canvas printed with unreal figures, a curtain apt to roll up at any moment on one real figure. But this afternoon, under the stress of the verse, and then under the shock of Stanhope's energetic speech, she had fractionally wandered. A play, was there a play? A play even that was known by some, and then not without peace? 10, 9. The Magus Zoroaster. Perhaps Zoroaster had not been frightened. Perhaps, if any of the great, if Caesar had met his own shape in Rome, or even Shelley, was there any tell of any who had? 6, 5, 4. Her heart sprang. There, a good way off, thanks to a merciful God it was, materialized from nowhere in a moment. She knew it at once, however far, her own young figure, her own walk, her own dress and hat. Had not her first sight of it been attracted so, changing, growing, it was coming up at her pace. Doppelganger, doppelganger. Control began to give. Too, she didn't run, lest it should, nor did it. She reached her gate, slipped through and went up the path. If it should be running very fast up the road behind her now, she was biting back the scream and fumbling for her key. Quiet, quiet, a terrible good. She got the key in the keyhole. She would not look back. Would it click the gate or not? The door opened and she was in, and the door banged behind her. She all but leant against it. Only the doppelganger might be leaning similarly on the other side. She went forward, her hands at her throat, up the stairs to her room, desiring, and every atom of energy left denying that her desire could be vain. Then there should be left to her still this one refuge in which she might find shelter.